What's going on, workforce? Brian and Chris here, and this is a topic that we saw, and just honestly, it excites me. It's probably going to be a difference of opinion. I don't want to put words in Chris's mouth, but we haven't pre-discussed this, so we're talking about a beautiful.
I read it to him and then cut him off and said, just like this. Cut him off. Interrupted. Just like this.
Just go. Just
said,
do
Brian,
it.
don't answer. Don't answer.
So
I'm just reading the question. Ignore the question mark.
Do you prefer Final Fantasy XIV's weapon-based jobs, or do you prefer Final Fantasy XI's other MMOs approach? And so when they say and other MMOs approach, this is a really big topic. I think I want to jump in to actually kind of read their kind of core statement here. Go ahead, Chris. You're raising your hand. I'm excited.
First of all, I'm going to be playing Heaven's Word for my very first time from August 7th through 11th, the 8th being the anniversary of Work to Game.
Yeah.
If you want to stop by, so that is when I celebrate my birthday. So don't expect that stream to get wildly derailed because it'll probably say like my birthday or channel birthday in the stream title. And then that Friday, the 12th, we're going to have a live letter, and Brian's hosting a New World fishing tournament for charity.
Yes.
Announcements out of the way.
Announcements out of the way. Okay. Yeah. Like I guess if we were more prepared and made better professional content, we would have been like, hey, here's the 3 bullet points. Now let's talk. I think there's arguments for both. I've been playing a lot of classic Final Fantasy XI due to the recent FC disbanding, and general burnout. Makes sense. We talk about managing burnout in 14 all the time. Anyhow, I'm kind of blanking with it. I feel like Final Fantasy XIV has a lot more class identity, at least compared to the early levels of 11. However, it's really fun to get to use weapons outside of the norm of those classes. For example, getting to use the scythe as a war is really cool concept for me. I think I'm just comparing these two is really unfair considering they're completely different games. However, I've always kind of wondered how the game would work if weapons were decoupled from jobs. And that is the thesis. And this is something I have, I'm a Final Fantasy vet. Chris has never played Final Fantasy XI. Chris, do you want to share any initial thoughts, or do you want me to explain to you how it works in Final Fantasy XI?
So what I would say is I come from WoW, where weapon types, a job has available to it, a job or class has available to it. It's allowed to equip certain weapon types, and that may affect, and like Guild Wars, where that may affect its kind of its weapon, its attack profile, how often it attacks, things like that. It's mostly a stat stick in WoW compared to Final Fantasy, where it also defines your job identity. The act of equipping it changes your job. And in Guild Wars, it determines your left side abilities. So you have a left 5 abilities and a right 5 abilities. Your right 5 abilities are determined by what 14 would call your job zone, effectively your specialization, your build. And your left side are determined by the weapon, though not every job uses every weapon in the same way. If you could picture, Brian is a bigger guy than like his wife, for example, and like you can picture they would probably hold a large axe differently. And so the different jobs kind of handle the weapons a bit differently, but they largely, like an axe is an axe, a sword is a sword, and the act of swapping does not decouple you from the class you play. Yeah.
So in Final Fantasy XI, to kind of set the context for those of you who do not, you've only played 14. Obviously 14 is you have a weapon and that is tied to the job, or AKA class. Basically it's the same concept. In 11, you have a job, and that job actually has multiple different types of weapons that it can equip. And based off of those weapons then determines obviously the skills that you have. So you do have job style abilities, and you then have weapon skills, and your weapon skills are in reference to the weapon that you have equipped. And so what would happen is that you would see that within the jobs, like certain jobs would be more I guess efficient when it would come to certain weapons, and less. And so they had various different ratings, A, B, C. So you would even have maybe even skill caps when it comes to that. This also then applied to obviously your sub job, even though like if you equipped a sub job, you couldn't then go and equip the weapon for that sub job, but you still had your like skill rankings and things like that. And I guess to bring in New World, a game that I'm like very passionate about, New World has such mirrored Final Fantasy 1.0 vibes, in the sense of where in 1.0 the idea was that you would obviously could swap out your weapon and that would change out your skills, and that kind of had that base mentality. And in New World, like you just literally hit a button and you swap and you have different skills, so you have a lot more build flexibility, and it's kind of designed with that. We got away with that in 1.0, and essentially I think probably for the best in terms of kind of their curated design. One of the things we talked about is that while I'd love to see the sub job system come into 14, I do recognize that content balancing wise and the speed in which content comes out, that would be the sacrifice. And so like I've advocated that maybe different content like Deep Dungeon, but Would I prefer a system in which that you actually had multiple weapons? Yes, absolutely now, especially now. Where like originally it kind of made sense where the class system was kind of that balance beam. Since we've gone really full job, the weapons, multiple weapons would be, I think, really interesting to see how they would play out. So you think about that aspect as opposed to like a sub-job system where, let's say, you had warriors with hammers and with axes, right? So not just a visual representation, but an actual way of changing how that job is built. So not every warrior is just like every warrior. You'd have, here's my hammer bro warrior and here's my axe warrior. And right. Yes, those are still tanks, but maybe they would offer something different. All of that being said is that when we start talking about that level of change, I don't expect that Final Fantasy XIV to adopt this at all, because the amount of work and balancing and who knows, probably even stress that players would go under. Like imagine if they came out and said like there's 2 warriors, like, well, I think you would even see people argue and advocate for like, well, just make another job, just make a hammer as a weapon that is that warrior job, right? So my preference though is more that player choice. I love the flexibility. I love that what it constituted, and this is why I don't think it would work in 14 though. What it constituted is that you would take the weapon for the content, right? Where in more modern MMOs, it's bring the player, not the job. This was bring the job, not the player. Like you would be going into a fight that said, this is really about blunt damage. So you really kind of leaned in more into damage types. These weapons deal more damage to this type of enemy. So you would actually be speccing for the fight as opposed to like, oh, I got match made into this and I didn't actually have the right weapon equipped and now we can't clear the content. So there's a very big design decision that has to be made early on. And that's why I do prefer the older method, but I know I'm only speaking for myself here.
Guild Wars still has a lot of that like spec and gear swapping. When you wipe on a fight, you stop and you reiterate because it's so much build variety.
Yeah.
I find myself as my Bladesworn warrior, if there's a lot of break bar, I want to make some weapon swaps to give me more of an ability to do some break bar damage. And like we have some other people swapping builds to get a little more, healing, or somebody's like, hey, can we switch who's handling the alacrity or whatever. So there's some stuff happening there. I'm not an expert on the game and I can already feel some of that happening. I imagine the people who are actually making the shots called, supposed to in the raid, usually they're all talking to each other and they're all like, yeah, Chris is just along for the ride. Like he doesn't really know what's going on. Don't assign him anything. Occasionally they assign me a role, but then it does, even when we wipe, they're like, no, you're going to keep doing what you've been doing.
Yeah.
Be in your corner, play with your toys. We'll be over here. We'll handle the rest of the fight. And so sometimes I'm assigned a significant role. Like you have to push this special action button or whatever, and that's fine. But then I'm only doing that. And so I look forward to getting to know that better. But I will say it is still happening in current MMOs. As for like what I'd prefer to see, because that's the original post question, I'd prefer to see a combat system that is thought through all the way from gearing to class design to long-term progression of the game, and then just let everything else fall in place. When you look at something like Fractals versus Mythic Plus versus Criterion, even if those were identical systems, they would feel inherently different because the gearing and classes feel different. So they define your experience through the game. And so I just want you to have a good, clean lens, not some blurry piece of glass that we're seeing the game through. The battle system defines our experience, no matter what you're doing. Open world content, PvP, the battle system defines our experience in MMORPGs. So whatever you do, stick with it, iterate on it instead of just toss it in the trash, and give us something that we can use as our base point to explore this world of yours.
Yeah.
As for what 14 could do to better mimic these, I think that the Jobstones, at this point, we don't really ever spend any time unequipping our Jobstones. Right. And since Summoner Scholar seems to be something they don't want to do again, where we have multiple Jobstones for one base class, I would say at this point, Jobstones need to be where our customization comes in. Jobstone materia, instead of having, if our materia was melded to our Jobstone, A, we would use more materia, and B, we would get away from that, like, red mage and black mage don't necessarily want the same stat priority. Warrior and paladin don't necessarily want the same stat priority. So I would say that if we're going to add variety, while I'd love the visual variety of weapons, I'd rather just move into stat build variety. Can I adjust swing speed and stuff like that first?
That'd be really interesting. That would be a small, to your point on the Jobstone, that would be a much smaller hurdle, because you do see that, and that so much gear is ended up being shared, is that you do end up saying, like, I want to be, this is the kind of the stat priority build that I'm going with on this specific job. And so I totally can get that. I think, and I'm really glad you actually brought up Criterion Dungeons, because within that, I believe they announced that you can actually change your job within the dungeon. I know that they're going to allow you to repair people's gears, but one of the things that I was like, I've run into, I don't know if you've ever done this, but whenever, let's say you lose a tank or a healer and you're like leveling up, and I'm like, you know what? Yeah, it's like, we're still searching. It's like, you know what? I could just switch. And take that role, sometimes it's like, it would be interesting to see like within that content. And what I kind of look at in terms of 14 now, as opposed to like, yeah, they're not going to overhaul the whole system, because that in and of itself is like, well, we're not going to get an expansion this year, because it's literally just like they're working on whatever, right? But within the system of that, like that's where I think you can end up seeing a little bit of that variety in terms of your build come into play. Not like in the middle of flat out combat, but the ability of like, oh man, we hit a wall. Like, there is clearly an advantage if you're a black mage in this fight versus, you coming as a dragoon, and then you're like, not a problem, I'm now a black mage, as opposed to dropping out and coming back in, right? And so
Frontlines is like that, right?
Exactly.
Frontlines, you die, you go back to the beginning, you're like, wow, we have got to have more healers.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. We're at a disadvantage, but I have that as an option. And one of the things that I think that would, and for me, and this could, you guys can let me know in the comments if you completely think Brian's crazy, but one of the things that would be for me is that I like leveling up the jobs, and I like to be able to bring that variety and that need. Sure. You and I like literally got everything we wanted with the PvP updates. If you guys go back into our archive, everything we said that they needed to do to fix the PvP problem, they did, and people love it. So I feel vindicated based off that feedback.
But the others are wrong.
Yeah, everybody who's right agrees with us. So saying at the internet. But on that note though, it's that when I step into content, and it's like having the ability to switch up that. Yeah, the weapons are the weapons, right? But to be able to sit down and say, you know what, like this guy's really weak to magic, and he's really strong against physical. Not a problem. Now there's that incentive for me to make sure I have that as an option. And it's not the entire game. It's a section of content within it. So that if you're like, listen, I don't like that. Guess what? There's other content that does not require you to go out and grind out other jobs, right? But if you're somebody who's nuts like this guy and has like, I'm not Omni 90, you got it, so I'm getting close. I'm really close. I'm hoping to have that knocked out pretty soon. But then it's like, oh, that's awesome. Like 30 levels out. Yeah. I like that in and of itself gives that value for me, having all these options. And then all of a sudden you can start talking about damage types. Monks are blunt damage versus slashing damage versus, piercing damage. Oh, this fight really benefits monks. Like it becomes maybe a piece of content that's bring the class and not the player. And then you can kind of design fights around that. And so there will be these walls, but it's not the entirety of the game. It ends up being kind of this piece of content that can really push and challenge your build. So that's something where that's why I'm glad you brought up that piece of content. We don't know what it's going to be. We're going to obviously learn more about the 12th. And again, hopefully you want to join us for that, but
you don't want it to be the whole game, because one of the things that, as I've been comparing MMOs more, and we've been doing spreadsheet streams, I've been trying to spend a little time every week in all three MMOs, just so I'm always top of mind. What is that community feeling? What am I feeling towards that game? And those are really up-to-date feelings. When you quit a game and you play another game, your comparisons are really accurate that day. But as years go by, you can slip out. So I've been trying to play some WoW and some Guild Wars every single week in addition to 14, so that I have a more up-to-date opinion. And when I look at those, one of my frustrations with WoW is that when you hit a lull where the current content doesn't appeal to you, or there isn't current content, they have the largest backlog of these three games when you look at the total amount of content they've added to their game. Just by sheer age alone, they've gotten there. Yeah. And they don't leverage a lot of it because their battle system has changed so much over the years. They can't. That's one of the big reasons. And at the beginning, they didn't design the system they designed this. Obviously, everybody's going to do the current thing, which is a reasonable assumption back then. But now 15 years later, you change your mind, and that foundational assumption becomes wrong. Yeah. It was a reasonable start, but in hindsight, Final Fantasy XIVs, who not necessarily for that reason, they designed us to have to go back because we have to help people through the story. But as a result, they accidentally stumbled into a system where now we have things like UCOB, which were not in the original plan. That was not in the ARR plan. Right. That can now live on because they have a system that is designed to be able to go back and do the story with these kind of sprouts and stuff. And so as a result, they've got this legacy content. Guild Wars' lateral system handles that inherently. And so when you look at that, I think there's something nice about leveraging it. So you don't want it to be game wide. What you want is a silo. You want something like Eureka or Bosja, where they can test things. If it turns out bad, then when the expansion expires after 2 years, you go, oh, I was just kidding.
Yeah,
and when it turns out good, you go, yeah, I'm just going to do more than that, obviously.
Oh,
that's right. I was going to do more than that.
Feels good, right?
So like it gives you the ability to have hindsight and always look like you're a genius. People who like Bosja was their first relic are like, wow, there's so much to this. Yeah, because they built on a bunch of previous relics. And so it looks like they came out of nowhere with some clever ideas. And it also allows them to actually do some out of nowhere stuff. The lost action system, I think, was a really neat way of exploring this post and saying,
yes, exactly.
How do you change the way we play in the lost action system? If you've ever done Deliberum Savage, where like it's not just a choice, you're like, no, I have this job to do. And so I am bringing this kind of subclass because this is my assigned role.
Right.
I think that's really neat.
Yeah, and that's where I err in. Whenever you hear my opinion, it's usually like player build. And yes, there's always going to feel like people are going to feel like the meta is controlling their choice. But that's the thing, and the beauty of it is it can change, it can shift, it can change by content to content. And I enjoy that aspect. I enjoy that about 11, like being able to pick my sub job, because that, certain things maybe make it more solo friendly versus like, well, if I'm coming into a group, then it ends up being a lot of pre-planning as opposed to just like random rolling the dice and the content being, you just kind of walk through it. So I'm obviously very excited for variant and criterion dungeons as we get to experience that here in the next coming months. But that's exactly why I connected so deeply with Bosja. It's like I get to choose. And we're together, like maybe I'm going to change my choice. But yeah, when I'm solo, this is what I prefer. And whether it's meta or it's not, that's really up to me. And that's something that I like to, that invites me to explore the game in a deeper way. It invites me into understanding and thinking through things where right now I just get my skills and then I just need to know how to use them. And there's a strength in both systems, right? Like if you make things too player choice driven, like it does cause stress. Some people are like, oh man, like there's so many choices with Blue Mage. And so it can cause stress. And so it's not I'm not sitting here saying like this is the way it should be for everybody, but like that's why I think within 14, the model ends up being design content. That's why I'm really excited to learn about the next deep dungeon. Does it bring in a variant of lost actions? Does it bring in more of these different kind of systems that, could end up opening up to like new challenges and new ways of kind of approaching the content? I honestly don't know, but I'm very excited to see where we go from here.
First relic that you and I ever completed each.
Yeah.
Separate for different reasons. The Shadowbringers, the Bosja system for different reasons had enough variety to it and had enough options that you and I both completed it, and we've both fallen off of every single prior relic. Anytime we've started a relic, we have not made it to the final step. And so I think the Bosja Zadnor, I think the Palace of the Dead type system, I think PvP actions. I think Final Fantasy has an example of saying if the content functions in Blue Mage, if the content needs to function inherently different, then we will silo that content off and it will function inherently different. So there is baseline content, things like everything from open world to hunts to fates to even raids, where the base battle system doesn't need to change. The content can just operate around it. But anything that is separate, Palace of the Dead, Heaven on High, PvP, all of PvP, the Eureka Zone, the Bosja Zone, all said, hey, I really can't do my job the way I want to do it without changing something. And the devs have said, cool, no problem, then let's make some changes. But those changes are locked within the boundaries of that content, so it doesn't drip out and accidentally break something else in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, guys, those are our thoughts. Excellent post. I'll include a link to it in the description if you want to go weigh in on the discussion over on the Reddit. But if you've made it a little bit to this point of the video, be sure to like the video. And if you haven't subscribed yet for the channel and you like these video game discussion breakouts, this is the place for it. So we actually just got both of us got a collab with Josh Strife Hayes on MMO content creators. And if you haven't seen that video, it's epic. I think we'll be posting our individual interviews with him on a respected channel. So like, I don't know
if this wasn't long enough for you, that one's 2 hours.
Yeah.
So if you were like, my problem with Word to Game is they only talk 20 to 30 minutes. Like I have good news for you over on Josh Strife Hayes.
So be sure to check out that video if you haven't already. It's a really good insight into MMO content creation and MMORPGs in general. Lots of behind the scenes of baseball. Really cool stuff. So, Chris, why don't you take us out?
Guys, it's super cool, and not just because Brian and I got our opinions in there. I was actually really honored to be among some pretty incredible creators, and they said some cool stuff. I'm only about halfway through it, but I'm really enjoying a lot of the perspectives in there. So definitely go give that a listen. I appreciate Josh putting that together. Absolutely incredible, and honored to be included. And other than that, guys, come hang out with us on stream. We're streaming a lot. We're posting a lot. We're excited for where 14 is going. We'll see you next time.
Take care.